A 14-year-old homeless boy just made a decision that will blow your mind. He's starving. 3 days without food. 1 meal left between him and death on Nigeria's brutal streets. Then he sees her, a pregnant woman collapsed behind a dumpster, dying. Here's the insane part. He gives her his only food and walks away hungry. Plot twist. She's not just any homeless woman. She's the wife of one of Nigeria's most powerful billionaires, thrown out of her mansion with nothing. The business card she hands him seems worthless. But wait, it gets crazy. 3 years later, this same boy is dying in a hospital after a horrific accident. Blood everywhere. Life slipping away. The doctor walks in and he can barely open his eyes to see the nurse standing over him. It's her. The pregnant woman he saved is now the nurse who holds his life in her hands. What happens next will make you question everything you think you know about karma, destiny, and the power of a single act of kindness. This 14-year-old's impossible choice triggered the most perfectly timed rescue in human history. And the ending? It'll change how you see every homeless person you pass, every moment you choose to help or walk away, and prove that sometimes saving others is the only way to save yourself. This isn't luck. This is the universe keeping score. And what it reveals about human connection will leave you speechless. The scorching Nigerian sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement of Abuja's bustling Woos market. But 14-year-old Julio barely felt its heat anymore. His dark skin, weathered beyond his years, had long ago adapted to the harsh realities of street life. What he couldn't adapt to was the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, a constant companion that had been with him for as long as he could remember. Most people who passed him on the street saw only what they wanted to see. A dirty street child, a nuisance, a reminder of problems they preferred to ignore. But if they had looked closer, really looked, they would have seen something remarkable in Julio's eyes. Despite the hunger, despite the loneliness, despite sleeping on cold concrete every night, there was still light there, still hope. Julio didn't remember having parents. His earliest memories were of other street children, older kids, who had taught him the unspoken rules of survival. Never trust the police, always check the garbage bins behind restaurants just after closing time, and never, ever let them see you cry. The older kids had moved on, some to juvenile detention, others to different cities, a few to fates he didn't want to think about. But Julio remained, a constant fixture in the ever-changing landscape of Abuja's forgotten children. His daily routine was as predictable as sunrise. Wake up before dawn on whatever patch of concrete had served as his bed. Shake off the stiffness from another night on the streets, and begin the endless search for bottles, cans, and scraps of metal that might earn him enough naira to buy a small portion of rice and beans. On good days, he might collect enough recyclables to earn 50 naira, enough for a modest meal. On bad days, which were increasingly common, he would go to bed with nothing but tap water sloshing in his empty stomach. The other street children called him Bottle Boy, but there was respect in the nickname. While other kids fought over territory or formed gangs, Julio worked alone, quietly and methodically. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot valuable items others missed. An aluminum can wedged between market stalls, a piece of copper wire glinting in a storm drain, plastic bottles that vendors carelessly tossed aside. But it wasn't just his scavenging skills that set Julio apart. In a world where kindness was often seen as weakness, where survival demanded a hardened heart, Julio remained inexplicably gentle. He shared his meager earnings with sick children who couldn't work. He saved scraps of food for the mangy dogs that roamed the market. When younger kids cried from hunger, he would tell them stories, fantastic tales of brave heroes and magical kingdoms where no one ever went hungry. The market vendors had mixed feelings about Julio. Unlike some street children who begged aggressively or stole, Julio was polite, almost invisible. He would approach with downcast eyes and speak softly. "Auntie, do you have any bottles you don't need?" Most ignored him, but a few, the ones who remembered their own difficult childhoods, would sometimes slip him a few coins or a piece of bread when their supervisors weren't looking. Mrs. Adebayo, who sold tomatoes from a wooden stall near the market's entrance, had watched Julio for 3 years. She had seen him grow taller and thinner, watched his clothes become more ragged, noticed how he never complained, even when customers shouted at him to move away from their stalls. One evening, after an especially good day of sales, she had given him a small bag of overripe tomatoes. "For your dinner," she had said gruffly, trying to hide her emotion. Julio had looked at the tomatoes with such gratitude that Mrs. Adebayo had to turn away. But what happened next was what she would never forget. Instead of eating the tomatoes immediately, Julio had carefully divided them into 3 portions. He ate 1 portion himself, gave another to a limping dog that lived near the market, and saved the 3rd for a younger street child who had been sick with fever. That night, Mrs. Adebayo went home and hugged her own children a little tighter. The rainy season was particularly cruel to Abuja's street children. When the sky opened up in torrential downpours, there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to stay dry. Julio's usual sleeping spot under the highway overpass would flood, forcing him to seek shelter wherever he could find it. During one especially severe storm, he had taken refuge in the doorway of a closed bank, sharing the small space with 3 other children and a pregnant cat. As the rain pounded the streets and lightning illuminated the night sky, Julio had noticed the cat was in distress. Without hesitation, he had removed his only shirt, already soaked through, and created a small shelter for the animal. By morning, the cat had given birth to 4 tiny kittens. Julio named them Hope, Faith, Joy, and Miracle. For 2 weeks he made sure the cat family had food and shelter, even when it meant he went hungry. He found a cardboard box behind a furniture store, lined it with scraps of cloth, and created a safe haven for the mother and her babies. Every morning, he would save a portion of whatever food he managed to find and bring it to the cat family. When the kittens were old enough to be weaned, Julio found homes for each of them. He approached families in the market, not asking for money, but simply explaining that these were special kittens who needed good homes. His sincerity and gentle manner convinced 4 different families to adopt the babies. The mother cat, which he had named Mama Grace, continued to visit him regularly, as if checking on the boy who had saved her family. This was who Julio was. A boy who had nothing but gave everything, who lived in hunger but fed others, who slept in the cold but provided warmth to those who needed it more. He was 14 years old, and he had already learned lessons about compassion that many adults never master. But on this particular morning, as the sun rose hot and bright over the city of Abuja, Julio would face a test that would define not just his character, but his entire future. He would be forced to choose between his own survival and the life of a complete stranger. And in that moment of decision, he would unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would prove the universe has a way of rewarding those who choose love over fear, generosity over greed, and hope over despair. The day started like any other. Julio's back ached from sleeping on the cold pavement, his lips were cracked from dehydration, and his stomach cramped from emptiness. He had not eaten in 2 days, but as he picked up his worn cloth sack, the same one he had used for collecting recyclables for over 3 years, he whispered a small prayer of gratitude. "Thank you for another day," he said to the sky, not sure if anyone was listening, but grateful all the same. He had no idea that this would be the day everything changed. The early morning air in Abuja carried the familiar mixture of exhaust fumes, cooking smoke, and the indefinable scent of a city waking up. Julio's bare feet navigated the broken pavement with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to read the streets like a book. He knew which gutters were most likely to yield treasures, which trash bins were emptied at what times, and which shortcuts would help him avoid the police officers who sometimes harassed street children. His stomach had moved beyond hunger pangs into that hollow, floating sensation that meant his body was beginning to consume itself. 2 days without food was dangerous territory, but Julio had survived worse. He had learned to ignore the dizziness, to push through the weakness, to keep moving, even when his vision blurred at the edges. The morning hunt began at the residential areas where wealthy families lived in compounds surrounded by high walls and security gates. These neighborhoods were gold mines for a boy who knew how to be invisible. Julio would slip through gaps in fences, move silently through gardens, and collect the recyclables that house helps threw away without sorting. Empty wine bottles, imported soft drink cans, and sometimes even small pieces of discarded electronics that could be sold for parts. But today, the residential areas yielded disappointingly little. A few crushed aluminum cans, 2 plastic bottles, and a bent metal spoon that might be worth a few naira if he could find the right buyer. Julio's sack felt frustratingly light as he made his way toward the commercial district, where his luck might be better. The morning sun was already becoming oppressive when he reached the area behind the large shopping complex. Here restaurants and cafes threw away their empty bottles and cans in large dumpsters that were gold mines for someone with patience and determination. Julio had learned to time his visits perfectly, early enough that the security guards were still changing shifts, late enough that the night's refuse had been deposited. He found a few more items, some plastic containers that had held imported beverages, a small piece of copper wire that had been discarded during construction work, and several glass bottles that were intact enough to be resold. His sack was beginning to feel heavier, and with it, his hope was growing. Maybe today would be one of the good days. But as he worked, Julio couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this morning. There was an energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that he couldn't quite identify. He had learned to trust his instincts on the streets. They had kept him alive this long, and something told him that today would be significant. By mid-morning, the sun was beating down mercilessly, and Julio's mouth was so dry he could barely swallow. He made his way to a public tap behind a government building, where he drank deeply and splashed water on his face. The cool liquid felt like a blessing against his sun-darkened skin. A security guard noticed him and frowned. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" "Just getting water, sir." Julio replied politely, stepping back from the tap. The guard studied him for a moment, taking in his torn clothes and the sack of recyclables. But something in Julio's respectful manner and honest eyes seemed to soften the man's expression. "You're the bottle boy who works around here, aren't you?" the guard asked. Julio nodded. "Yes, sir." The guard reached into his pocket and pulled out a 10 naira note. "Here, buy yourself something to eat." Julio's eyes widened. 10 naira was more than he usually earned in a morning of scavenging. "Thank you, sir. God bless you." The guard waved him away, but Julio caught the small smile on the man's face as he walked away. These moments of unexpected kindness were like rays of sunshine breaking through clouds. They reminded Julio that not everyone in the world was indifferent to suffering, that there were still good people who cared about others. With the 10 naira in his pocket, Julio felt a surge of energy. Combined with whatever he could get for his recyclables, he might actually be able to buy a proper meal today. The thought made his stomach growl audibly, and he quickened his pace toward the market where he could sell his collected items and then buy food. The Wu's market was already in full swing when Julio arrived. Vendors were setting up their stalls, customers were beginning to browse, and the air was filled with the sounds of commerce, haggling voices, the clink of money changing hands, and the general buzz of human activity. This was where the city's heartbeat was strongest, where fortunes were made and lost in naira and kobo. Julio made his way to the section where Malam Garba operated his small recycling business. The old man had been buying recyclables from street children for over 20 years, and he had a reputation for being fair. More than could be said for many of the middlemen who took advantage of desperate kids. "Ah, Julio," Malam Garba called out when he saw him approaching. "What do you have for me today?" Julio emptied his sack carefully, arranging the items so the old man could see everything clearly. This was another lesson he had learned. Always be honest about what you're selling. Trust was the most valuable currency on the streets, and once you lost it, you might never get it back. Malam Garba examined each item with the practiced eye of someone who'd been in the business for decades. He weighed the metal pieces, counted the bottles, and tested the quality of the plastic containers. "This copper wire is good quality," he said approvingly, "and these bottles are clean. You take care of your merchandise, boy." After a few minutes of calculation, Malam Garba reached into his cash box. 25 naira, he announced. Julio's heart leaped. 25 naira plus the 10 naira gift from the security guard meant he would have 35 naira to spend on food. That was enough for a proper meal of rice and beans, maybe even with a small piece of meat. "Thank you, Malam," Julio said, accepting the money with both hands in the traditional gesture of respect. "You're a good boy, Julio," the old man said. "I've been watching you for years. You work hard, you don't steal, you don't cause trouble. That's rare these days." Julio felt a warmth spread through his chest at the praise. In a world where he was often invisible or viewed as a nuisance, being recognized for his character meant everything. With 35 naira burning a hole in his pocket, Julio made his way through the market toward the food section. The smells were intoxicating. Roasted corn, fried plantains, spicy jollof rice, and grilled meat. His stomach responded with a symphony of growls and gurgles that made him feel slightly embarrassed. He paused at several stalls, mentally calculating what he could afford. A plate of plain rice and beans would cost about 30 naira, leaving him with 5 naira for tomorrow. But if he was careful, he might be able to find a vendor who would give him a slightly larger portion for the same price. As he walked through the food section, Julio noticed a young woman sitting alone at a table, eating a plate of rice and stew. She was well dressed, with gold jewelry and expensive-looking clothes, but there was something in her eyes that looked familiar to him, a kind of sadness that he recognized from his own reflection in storefront windows. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the woman smiled at him. It was a genuine smile, not the pitying look he usually got from wealthy people. Without really thinking about it, Julio found himself smiling back. "Excuse me," the woman called out softly. "Are you hungry?" Julio hesitated. He had learned to be wary of strangers, especially those who seemed too interested in helping street children. But there was something about this woman that felt safe. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit. Let me buy you something to eat." Julio's first instinct was to refuse. He had his own money now, and he had learned that accepting charity often came with strings attached. But something about the woman's manner, not condescending or performative, but genuinely kind, made him reconsider. "Thank you, ma'am, but I have money," he said, showing her his 35 naira. The woman's smile widened. "I can see that, but I insist. Please, it would make me happy to share a meal with you." And so, for the first time in months, Julio found himself sitting at a proper table, eating a proper meal, with someone who seemed genuinely interested in his well-being. The woman introduced herself as Sister Mary. She was a nurse at one of the city's hospitals, and she asked him about his life, with a kind of genuine curiosity that made him feel like a real person, rather than just another street child. "How long have you been on the streets?" she asked gently. "I don't remember not being on the streets," Julio replied honestly. "Maybe since I was very small." "Do you go to school?" Julio shook his head. "I can't read very well. Never had the chance to learn properly." Sister Mary nodded thoughtfully. "Reading is important. Maybe I can help you with that someday." They talked for nearly an hour, and Julio found himself opening up in ways he rarely did. There was something about Sister Mary that made him feel safe, accepted, valued. When their meal was finished, she pressed a 50 naira note into his hand. "For tomorrow," she said. "And remember, you're a good boy, Julio. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Julio walked away from the restaurant, his stomach full and his heart lighter than it had been in weeks, he reflected on the strange generosity he had experienced that day, the security guard, Malam Garba's fair price, and now Sister Mary's kindness. It was as if the universe was conspiring to remind him that he was not alone in the world. But the universe wasn't finished with him yet. As he made his way back toward the market's exit, planning to find a comfortable place to rest for the afternoon, he would encounter a situation that would test everything he believed about kindness, sacrifice, and the true meaning of humanity. The sun was reaching its peak intensity, and the market was bustling with the lunchtime rush. Julio decided to take a shortcut through the alley behind the main market building, where it would be cooler and less crowded. It was a decision that would change everything. The alley behind the main market building was a narrow passage that most people avoided. It was where the market's refuse was stored before collection, where stray dogs scavenged for scraps, and where the less fortunate sometimes sought shelter from the sun. The air was thick with the smell of decomposing organic matter, and flies buzzed lazily in the afternoon heat. Julio had used this route many times before. It was quieter than the main market thoroughfares, and sometimes he could find items that others had overlooked. Today, with his stomach finally full and money still in his pocket, he wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply enjoying the rare sensation of not being driven by desperate hunger. As he walked past the large green dumpster that served the restaurants on the other side of the building, something caught his eye. At first he thought it was just a pile of discarded clothes, but as he looked closer, he realized it was a person, a woman, lying motionless beside the dumpster. Julio's first instinct was to keep walking. The streets had taught him that getting involved in other people's problems was usually a mistake. But something about the woman's position, the way she was curled up with her hands, protecting her swollen belly, made him pause. She was pregnant, very pregnant. Against his better judgment, Julio approached cautiously. The woman was wearing clothes that had once been expensive, a traditional Nigerian dress made from quality fabric, but they were now dirty and torn. Her hair, which had clearly been professionally styled not long ago, was matted and unkempt. But it was her face that stopped Julio cold. Even in her unconscious state, even with the grime and exhaustion etched in her features, there was something aristocratic about her bone structure. This was not someone who belonged in an alley behind a market. This was a woman who had fallen from somewhere much higher. "Madame," Julio called softly, kneeling beside her. "Madame, are you okay?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, and Julio found himself looking into the most beautiful and sad eyes he had ever seen. They were the eyes of someone who had lost everything, someone who had been stripped of dignity and hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My baby. I think something is wrong." Julio's heart began to race. This was beyond anything he had ever dealt with. He was just a street child. What did he know about helping pregnant women? But as he looked at her face, saw the desperation and fear in her eyes, he knew he couldn't just walk away. "When did you last eat?" he asked. The woman tried to remember. "Yesterday? No, maybe the day before. I'm not sure." Julio looked at her belly, which was large and heavy. The baby inside her was probably near full term, which meant it needed nutrition desperately. He thought about the money in his pocket, the 50 naira that Sister Mary had given him for tomorrow's food, plus the few naira he had left from his recyclables. For a moment, he hesitated. That money represented his own survival, his own meals for the next few days. But as he looked at the woman's face, at the way her hands protectively cradled her unborn child, he knew there was really no choice at all. "Here," he said gently, "I'll be right back." Julio hurried back to the main market, his mind racing. He needed to find food that would be nutritious but gentle on someone who hadn't eaten in days. He also needed to find water, and maybe something to help clean her up. At one of the food stalls, he bought a large portion of rice and beans, specifically asking for extra beans because he knew they were full of protein. He also bought a bottle of clean water and a small portion of fried plantains. At another stall, he purchased a small towel and a bar of soap. The purchases cost him nearly all his money, leaving him with just enough for a small meal for himself the next day. When he returned to the alley, The woman was still lying in the same position, but she was conscious and watching for him. Her eyes widened when she saw the food. You bought this for me?" she asked, disbelief clear in her voice. "Yes, Mom, you need to eat. Your baby needs you to eat." Julio helped her sit up against the wall, then opened the container of rice and beans. The woman looked at the food with an expression of such profound gratitude that it made Julio's chest tight with emotion. "I don't understand," she said. "You don't even know me. Why would you help me?" Julio thought about the question for a moment. "Because I know what it feels like to be hungry," he said simply. "I know what it feels like when people look at you like you don't matter. Nobody should have to feel that way." The woman began to cry, not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. "My name is Natasha," she said, "and I want you to know that what you're doing, it's saving 2 lives right now." As Natasha ate, slowly and carefully, Julio used the towel and soap to clean her face and hands. He worked gently, with the same care he had shown to injured animals he had found on the streets. There was something about caring for others that came naturally to him, as if it was written into his very DNA. "Where do you live?" he asked. Natasha's face clouded over. "I don't. Not anymore." "What happened?" The story came out in fragments, between bites of food and sips of water. Natasha had been married to a wealthy businessman, living in luxury until she discovered his infidelity. When she confronted him, he had thrown her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. She had been on the streets for weeks, too proud to ask for help from friends who might side with her husband, too afraid to go to her family who had warned her against the marriage in the first place. "I kept thinking someone would help," she said. "I kept thinking that because I was pregnant, because I was obviously not someone who belonged on the streets, someone would take pity on me. But people just looked away. They saw my condition, and they looked away." Julio nodded. He understood that reaction all too well. "How long until the baby comes?" he asked. "Soon," Natasha said, placing her hand on her belly. "Maybe a week or 2. I'm scared. I have nowhere to go, no money, no way to get to a hospital." Julio was quiet for a moment, thinking. He didn't have much, but he had connections. He knew people who might be able to help, places where a pregnant woman might be able to stay temporarily. "There's a church near here," he said. "Pastor Emmanuel is a good man. He helps people sometimes. And there's a clinic not far from there where they don't ask too many questions if you can't pay." Natasha looked at him with wonder. "You would help me find these places?" "Of course. But why? I have nothing to give you in return." Julio smiled, and for the first time in days, it was a completely genuine smile. Sometimes we help people because we can, not because we expect something back. As the afternoon wore on, Julio helped Natasha to the church. Pastor Emmanuel was indeed a good man, and he immediately arranged for Natasha to stay in a small room behind the church. He also contacted a nurse from the local clinic who came to check on her condition. "The baby is healthy," the nurse reported, "but you need rest and proper nutrition. This young man saved your life bringing you here when he did." That evening, as Julio prepared to leave, Natasha called him back. "Julio," she said, reaching into the small bag she'd managed to keep with her through all her troubles. "I want you to have this." She handed him a business card. It was bent and worn, but still legible. It had her name and a phone number, along with the logo of a major hospital in the city. "I'm a nurse," she explained. Or I was, before I got married, and my husband made me stop working. This is my old business card. I keep it to remind myself of who I used to be." Julio looked at the card. He couldn't read all the words, but he could see her name, Natasha Okafor, RN. "If you ever need help," she said, "if you ever need anything at all, you'll find me. I don't know where I'll be or what I'll be doing, but I promise you I will help you any way I can." Julio carefully folded the card and put it in his pocket. "Thank you. But I hope you won't need to worry about me. I hope you'll be too busy being happy with your baby." As he walked back to his usual sleeping spot that night, Julio felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of purpose. He had made a difference in someone's life, maybe even saved 2 lives. The thought made him feel larger than his 14 years, more important than his circumstances. He had no way of knowing that the business card in his pocket would become the most valuable thing he owned. He had no way of knowing that the woman he had helped would spend the next several years thinking about him, wondering if he was safe, hoping that life would be kind to him. And he certainly had no way of knowing that years later, when he was lying broken and bleeding on a hospital bed, that same woman would be the one standing between him and death, ready to repay a debt that she had never forgotten. But that night, as he settled down to sleep on the familiar concrete, Julio simply felt grateful. Grateful for the chance to help someone. Grateful for the reminder that kindness was still possible in a harsh world. And grateful for the hope that tomorrow might bring something even better. The business card was safe in his pocket, and with it, the promise of a connection that would prove stronger than either of them could have imagined. 3 years later, the years had been kind to neither Julio nor Natasha, but they had been survivors in their own ways. Julio, now 17, had grown taller and stronger, his child's face sharpened into the angular features of a young man. But his circumstances remained largely unchanged. He still lived on the streets, still collected recyclables, still slept wherever he could find shelter. What had changed was his reputation. The street children called him Brother Julio now, and he had become something of a legend in the informal network of Abuja's forgotten youth. He was the one who shared his food when others were hungry, who stood up to the older boys who bullied the younger ones, who knew which police officers could be trusted and which ones to avoid. Julio had also become more strategic in his survival. He had learned to read, not fluently, but well enough to understand signs and simple text. He had figured out the schedules of the various businesses whose recyclables he collected, and he had built relationships with vendors who would sometimes give him odd jobs that paid better than scavenging. But the business card remained in his pocket, carefully wrapped in a piece of plastic to protect it from the rain and his own sweat. He had never used it, never tried to contact Natasha. The idea of reaching out to someone from his past, someone who had moved on to a better life, felt like an intrusion. Besides, what would he say? That he was still living on the streets, that nothing had changed. In a different part of the city, Natasha's life had taken a remarkable turn. After giving birth to a healthy daughter she named Zuri, she had slowly rebuilt her life from nothing. The church had provided temporary shelter, but Natasha knew she needed to become self-sufficient. Using her nursing credentials, she had found work at a small clinic in one of Abuja's middle-class neighborhoods. The pay was modest, but it was steady. She rented a small one-bedroom apartment, furnished it with second-hand furniture, and created a humble but loving home for herself and her daughter. Zuri had grown into a bright, curious 3-year-old with her mother's beautiful eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She was the center of Natasha's world, the reason for every decision she made, the source of every dream she harbored for the future. But Natasha never forgot the boy who had saved them both. She often told Zuri the story of how a young man named Julio had given them food when they had nothing, how he had helped them find shelter when they were desperate. She told her daughter that there were angels in the world, and that sometimes they looked like ordinary people doing extraordinary things. "Will we see Julio again, Mama?" Zuri would ask. "I hope so, baby," Natasha would reply. "I hope so." Natasha had tried to find Julio several times over the years. She had walked through the market where they met, asking vendors if they had seen a young man who collected bottles and cans. But the streets were constantly changing, and the people who might have known Julio were often transient themselves. What she didn't know was that Julio was still there, still moving through the same areas, still surviving in the shadow of the city's prosperity. Their paths had crossed several times without either of them knowing it. Julio had walked past the clinic where Natasha worked, and she had driven past corners where he stood waiting for opportunities to earn money. It was as if the universe was keeping them apart, saving their reunion for a moment when it would mean the most. During these years, both Julio and Natasha had grown in ways that their younger selves couldn't have imagined. Julio had become a protector of the vulnerable, a quiet leader among the street children. He had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of urban poverty, to find opportunity in the most unlikely places, and to maintain his humanity despite the dehumanizing conditions of his daily existence. Natasha had rediscovered her professional identity and personal strength. She had advanced in her nursing career, taking on additional responsibilities at the clinic. She had also begun volunteering at a shelter for homeless women, driven by her own memories of desperation and the kindness of strangers. But despite their growth, despite their resilience, both carried something with them from that day in the alley behind the market. For Julio, it was the memory of being able to make a difference, the knowledge that even someone with nothing could still give something meaningful to another person. For Natasha, it was the debt of gratitude that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be human, to be connected to others regardless of social status or circumstances. Neither of them knew that their paths were about to converge again, in circumstances that would test everything they had learned about survival, sacrifice, and the power of human connection. The stage was being set for a reunion that would prove the universe has a sense of timing that defies human understanding, a way of bringing people together exactly when they need each other most. It was a Tuesday morning, and the rainy season had just begun in Abuja. The sky was heavy with clouds that promised another afternoon of torrential downpours, but for now, the air was just humid and oppressive. Julio had woken early, as he always did, on the piece of cardboard that served as his bed under the Berger Bridge. At 17, he had developed a routine that maximized his chances of survival. Early morning was the best time to collect recyclables from the wealthy neighborhoods, before the house helps, had time to sort through the garbage themselves. He would work the residential areas until mid-morning, then move to the commercial districts, and finally end up at the market where he could sell his collections to Malam Garba. This Tuesday started like any other. Julio's sack yielded a decent collection of bottles and cans from the Maitama district, where diplomats and government officials lived in houses that seemed like palaces to someone who slept on the streets. He had learned to move quietly through these neighborhoods, to be invisible to the security guards who sometimes chased street children away. By late morning, he was making his way toward the central business district, where construction sites often yielded valuable metal scraps. His sack was already half full, and he was feeling optimistic about the day's prospects. The humidity was making him sweat more than usual, but that was a small price to pay for the promise of rain later, which would wash the dust from the air and cool the oppressive heat. As he walked along one of the busy main roads, Julio noticed increased activity at a construction site across the street. Workers were moving large pieces of metal framework, and he could see several pieces of copper wiring that had been discarded in a pile near the road. Copper was valuable, much more valuable than aluminum cans or plastic bottles. If he could get to those pieces before other scavengers noticed them, he could earn enough money to eat well for several days. The traffic was heavy, as it always was during the late morning rush. Cars, buses, motorcycles, and commercial trucks competed for space on roads that had been designed for much lighter traffic. But Julio had crossed busy streets thousands of times. He knew how to read the patterns, how to time his movements, how to find the gaps between vehicles. He stood at the edge of the road, watching the flow of traffic. A large truck was approaching from his left, but it was moving slowly in the congested conditions. Behind it, he could see a gap that would give him enough time to cross. He waited for the truck to pass, then stepped into the road. What Julio couldn't see, what no one could see until it was too late, was the small delivery van that was speeding down the shoulder of the road, trying to get around the slower traffic. The van's driver was frustrated by the congestion, running late for an important delivery, and making the kind of risky decisions that city drivers made every day. Julio was halfway across the road when he heard the screech of brakes. He turned his head and saw the van bearing down on him, the driver's eyes wide with panic. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Julio tried to jump backward, but the van was moving too fast, and he was caught in that terrible space where neither forward nor backward movement would save him. The impact was devastating. The van struck Julio on his right side, sending him flying through the air like a broken doll. His sack of recyclables exploded on impact, sending bottles and cans scattered across the asphalt. He hit the ground hard, rolled several times, and then lay still. For a moment, the busy street went silent. Then suddenly everyone was shouting at once, "Someone call an ambulance! Is he alive? That's the bottle boy who works around here. Look how much blood there is." The van driver, a middle-aged man named Mr. Attawale, stumbled out of his vehicle in shock. He was shaking so badly he could barely stand. "I didn't see him," he kept repeating. "I didn't see him until it was too late." A crowd gathered around Julio's motionless form. Blood was pooling beneath his head, and his right leg was bent at an unnatural angle. His breathing was shallow and irregular. Several people tried to help, But it was clear that his injuries were beyond what anyone without medical training could handle. "We need to get him to a hospital," said a woman who'd been walking nearby. "Now." "Which hospital?" someone asked. "The general hospital is too far, and the private ones won't take him without money." "St. Grace Hospital," suggested another voice. "It's closest, and they have a good emergency department." An ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, an eternity for someone with Julio's injuries, but remarkably fast by Lagos standards. The paramedics worked quickly and professionally, stabilizing Julio's neck, starting an IV, and getting him onto a stretcher. As they loaded him into the ambulance, one of the paramedics noticed something that had fallen from Julio's pocket during the accident. It was a small piece of plastic-wrapped paper. He picked it up and handed it to his partner. "Probably important," he said. "We should keep it with his belongings." The business card that Natasha had given Julio 3 years earlier, carefully preserved through rain and heat, through countless nights on the streets, through the daily struggles of survival, was now riding in an ambulance with its owner, both of them racing toward a reunion that neither could have imagined. St. Grace Hospital was a mid-sized facility that served Abuja's middle class, and the overflow from the overcrowded government hospitals. It had a reputation for competent care and reasonable prices, though reasonable was relative when you were talking about people who lived on the streets. The emergency department was busy that Tuesday afternoon, as it always was. Nurses moved efficiently between treatment rooms, doctors consulted charts and made rapid decisions, and the controlled chaos of medical care played out in the fluorescent-lit corridors. Nurse Natasha Okafor had been working at St. Grace for 6 months. She had transferred from the smaller clinic where she had rebuilt her career, drawn by the opportunity for more advanced training and better pay. The work was demanding, but she thrived in the fast-paced environment of emergency medicine. At 28, Natasha had grown into a confident, skilled professional. The frightened, abandoned woman who had collapsed behind a market dumpster was now a distant memory, replaced by someone who commanded respect from colleagues and gratitude from patients. She had an intuitive understanding of suffering that made her exceptionally good at her job, and a gentleness that came from having experienced helplessness herself. She was updating a patient chart when the ambulance arrived. Through the emergency department's glass doors, she could see the paramedics working urgently to transfer someone from their vehicle to a hospital gurney. From the speed of their movements and the amount of equipment they were using, she knew it was serious. "Incoming trauma," called out Dr. Ogbonna, the emergency department's senior physician. Male, approximately 17 years old, struck by a vehicle, head trauma, possible internal injuries, broken leg. He's unconscious. Natasha looked up from her chart, professional instinct kicking in. She moved toward the trauma bay, mentally preparing for whatever she might encounter. She had seen many accident victims in her time at St. Grace, and she had learned to maintain emotional distance while providing compassionate care. But when the gurney rolled through the doors, when she saw the patient's face, her world stopped spinning. Even unconscious, even covered in blood and road dust, even changed by the years that had passed since their last meeting, she recognized him immediately. The bone structure, the shape of his hands, the scar on his left eyebrow that she remembered from that day in the alley. It was unmistakably Julio. "Oh, my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Ogbonna was giving rapid orders to the trauma team. But Natasha barely heard him. She stared at Julio's still form, memories flooding back with overwhelming intensity. The hungry boy who had shared his last meal with a desperate stranger. The gentle young man who had helped her find shelter when she had nowhere else to turn. The person who had saved her life and her daughter's life with one simple act of kindness. "Nurse Okafor." Dr. Ogbonna's voice cut through her shock. "I need you to assist with the examination." Natasha snapped back to the present, her professional training overriding her emotional response. But her hands were shaking as she moved to help with Julio's care. The examination revealed the extent of his injuries. He had a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured right leg, and significant internal bleeding. His condition was critical but not hopeless. With proper care, he could survive. "Do we have any information about next of kin?" Dr. Ogbonna asked. "No identification," replied one of the paramedics. "Just this." He handed over the plastic-wrapped business card. "Found it in his pocket." Dr. Ogbonna glanced at the card and was about to hand it to the administrative staff when Natasha stepped forward. "Doctor," she said quietly, "I'd like to be assigned as his primary nurse." Dr. Ogbonna looked at her with surprise. It was unusual for nurses to request specific patients, especially trauma cases that required intensive care. "Any particular reason?" he asked. Natasha took a deep breath. "I know him. He saved my life once. I'd like to make sure he gets the best possible care." Dr. Ogbonna studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. But this is a serious case, Nurse Okafor. He'll need round-the-clock monitoring for at least the first 48 hours. "I understand, Doctor. I'll take care of him." As the trauma team worked to stabilize Julio, Natasha found herself fighting back tears. The irony wasn't lost on her. The boy who had rescued her when she was broken and helpless was now lying broken and helpless himself, and she was the one with the power to help him. Over the next several hours, as Julio was moved to the intensive care unit, Natasha barely left his side. She monitored his vital signs, adjusted his medications, and watched for any signs of improvement or deterioration. Her colleagues noticed her unusual dedication to this particular patient, but they respected her professionalism and didn't ask questions. Late that evening, when the ICU was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of machines, Natasha pulled a chair close to Julio's bed. He was still unconscious, his face pale but peaceful. The machines showed that his vital signs were stable, which was encouraging, but he wasn't out of danger yet. "Julio," she said softly, taking his hand in hers. "It's me. It's Natasha, the woman you helped 3 years ago behind the market. I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know that you're safe now. I'm going to take care of you the way you took care of me." She told him about Zuri, about how her daughter had grown into a beautiful, bright little girl who loved hearing stories about the kind young man who had helped her mama when she needed it most. She told him about her job, about how she had rebuilt her life from nothing, about how every good thing that had happened to her could be traced back to his act of kindness. "You gave me hope when I had none," she whispered. "You showed me that there was still goodness in the world when I thought it had all disappeared. And now it's my turn to give you hope." As the night wore on, Natasha maintained her vigil. She had told Dr. Ogbonna that she would monitor Julio around the clock, and she meant it. She dozed fitfully in the chair beside his bed, waking every few minutes to check his condition. Just before dawn, as the first hints of sunlight began to filter through the ICU windows, Julio's eyelids fluttered. Natasha was instantly alert, leaning forward to watch for signs of consciousness. "Julio?" she said gently. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry from the breathing tube that had been removed a few hours earlier. Where am I?" he managed to whisper. Natasha felt tears of relief streaming down her face. "You're in a hospital, Julio. You were in an accident, but you're going to be okay. You're safe now." Julio tried to focus on her face. Something about her voice was familiar, but his head felt like it was full of cotton, and thinking was difficult. Do I know you?" he asked. Natasha smiled through her tears. "Yes, you do. But rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger. I promise you, everything is going to be all right." As Julio drifted back into sleep, Natasha squeezed his hand gently. The boy who had saved her life was now under her protection, and she was going to make sure that he not only survived, but thrived. The circle was beginning to close. Over the next 3 days, Julio drifted in and out of consciousness as his body began the slow process of healing. Each time he woke, Natasha was there, checking his vital signs, adjusting his pillows, or simply sitting quietly beside his bed. There was something comforting about her presence, something that made him feel safe, even in his confused and vulnerable state. The medical staff at St. Grace had seen many dedicated nurses over the years, but Natasha's attention to this particular patient was extraordinary. She had essentially moved into the ICU, sleeping in the chair beside Julio's bed and taking her meals in the hospital cafeteria so she wouldn't have to leave him for more than a few minutes at a time. Dr. Ogbonna approached her on Thursday morning with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Nurse Okafor," he said gently, "I appreciate your dedication to this patient, but you need to take care of yourself, too. When was the last time you went home?" Natasha looked up from the chart she was updating. Her eyes were tired, and her usually immaculate uniform was wrinkled from sleeping in a chair. But her expression was determined. "I'm fine, Doctor. He's showing good signs of improvement, but he's not out of the woods yet. I want to be here when he's fully conscious. This young man must be very important to you," Dr. Ogbonna observed. Natasha nodded. "He is, more than I can explain." That afternoon, Julio woke with greater clarity than he had shown since the accident. The fog in his head was beginning to lift, and while his body still ached from his injuries, his mind felt more like his own. He found Natasha reading quietly in the chair beside his bed. She was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple blouse, rather than her nurse's uniform, and her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail. There was something about her face that tugged at his memory, something familiar and comforting. "You're not wearing a uniform today," he said, his voice still hoarse, but stronger than before. Natasha looked up and smiled. "I'm off duty, but I wanted to stay with you. How are you feeling?" "Like I was hit by a truck," Julio said, then winced as he tried to smile. "Which I guess I was. A delivery van, actually. But yes, you took quite a beating." Natasha set down her book and moved closer to his bed. "Do you remember anything about the accident?" Julio closed his eyes, trying to piece together his memories. "I was crossing the street. There was construction work. and I saw some copper wire I wanted to collect. Then—" He shook his head. "Nothing after that. You've been unconscious for 3 days. You have a concussion, some broken ribs, and a fractured leg. But you're going to be fine. You're lucky to be alive." Julio nodded, then studied Natasha's face more carefully. The familiarity was stronger now, nagging at the edges of his consciousness like a word on the tip of his tongue. "I know you," he said suddenly. "I know you, but I can't remember from where." Natasha's heart began to beat faster. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when he would remember who she was and what they meant to each other. "Think back," she said gently. 3 years ago, behind the market, a pregnant woman who had collapsed next to a dumpster. Julio's eyes widened as the memory came flooding back. He stared at Natasha's face, seeing past the changes that time and better circumstances had brought, recognizing the eyes that had looked at him with such gratitude all those years ago. "Natasha," he whispered. "Oh my God, you're Natasha?" Tears were streaming down both their faces now. Natasha reached for his hand, and he gripped it tightly, as if afraid she might disappear. "You saved my life," she said. "You and my baby's life. And now I get to save yours." "Your baby," Julio said, remembering. "You were so close to giving birth. What happened? Is your child okay?" Natasha's smile could have powered the entire hospital. "She's perfect. Her name is Zuri, and she's 3 years old now. Beautiful and smart and kind. Just like the man who made her existence possible." They talked for hours, filling in the gaps of the years that had passed. Natasha told him about Zuri's birth, about how she had rebuilt her life, about her nursing career, and the small apartment where she and her daughter lived. Julio told her about his continued life on the streets, about the other children he had helped, about the quiet ways he had tried to make the world a little better, despite his own circumstances. "I kept your business card," Julio said suddenly. "All these years, I kept it in my pocket. I never used it because I didn't want to bother you. I figured you had moved on to a better life." "Where is it now?" Natasha asked. "I don't know. Maybe the paramedics have it, or the hospital staff." Natasha reached into her purse and pulled out a small piece of plastic-wrapped paper. "You mean this?" Julio stared at the familiar business card, worn and bent, but still carefully preserved. "You had it? The paramedics gave it to the hospital when they brought you in. When I saw it, I knew it was fate. After 3 years of wondering if you were okay, of hoping our paths would cross again, the universe brought you back to me." "I can't believe you're here," Julio said. "I can't believe you're taking care of me." "Where else would I be?" Natasha replied. "You were there for me when I had nothing. Now I'm here for you." That evening, Natasha called her babysitter and asked if she could keep Zuri overnight again. She wasn't ready to leave Julio's side, not when they had so much to talk about, so much to catch up on. "There's something I need to tell you," Natasha said as they sat together in the quiet ICU. "Something I've wanted to say for 3 years, but never had the chance." Julio waited, watching her face in the dim light. "That day you helped me. You didn't just give me food and find me shelter. You gave me hope. You showed me that there was still kindness in the world, that not everyone was selfish and cruel. When I was ready to give up, when I thought there was no point in going on, you reminded me that there were still good people in the world." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Everything good that has happened to me since that day, my job, my home, my ability to be a good mother to Zuri, it all started with your kindness. You didn't just save my life, Julio. You saved my faith in humanity." Julio felt overwhelmed by her words. He had never thought of his action in such grand terms. To him it had simply been the right thing to do, the human thing to do. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he said quietly. I couldn't walk away from someone who needed help." "That's exactly what made it heroic," Natasha replied. "Heroes don't set out to be heroes. They just do what's right, when it matters most." As the night wore on, they continued to talk, sharing stories and memories, marveling at the strange turns their lives had taken. Julio learned that Natasha had thought about him often over the years, that she had tried to find him, that she had told Zuri stories about the kind young man who had helped them when they needed it most. "Zuri is going to be so excited to meet you," Natasha said. "She's heard so many stories about Uncle Julio that she thinks you're practically a superhero." The thought of meeting Zuri, the baby whose life he had helped save, filled Julio with a kind of joy he hadn't felt in years. But it also made him acutely aware of his own circumstances. "Natasha," he said hesitantly, "when I get out of here, I'll be going back to the streets. I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't want Zuri to see me like that, to know that the person in her stories is just a homeless boy." Natasha was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled with a certainty that surprised them both. "No," she said firmly. "You're not going back to the streets. You're coming home with me." The next morning brought Dr. Ogbona's daily rounds, and with them good news about Julio's recovery. His vital signs were strong. The swelling in his brain had reduced significantly, and his other injuries were healing well. While he would need several more days in the hospital and weeks of physical therapy for his leg, he was officially out of danger. "You have someone very special looking after you," Dr. Ogbona told Julio as he reviewed the chart. "Nurse Okafor has barely left your side since you arrived. In 20 years of medicine, I've rarely seen such dedication." After the doctor left, Julio turned to Natasha with a serious expression. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Yesterday, when you said I was coming home with you, did you mean it?" "Of course I meant it," Natasha replied without hesitation. "Where else would you go?" "But you don't understand," Julio said, struggling to find the right words. "I've been living on the streets for my entire life. I don't know how to live in a house, how to be part of a family. I don't want to be a burden to you and Zuri." Natasha pulled her chair closer to his bed. "Julio, listen to me. 3 years ago I was lying in an alley, pregnant and starving, with nowhere to go and no one to help me. I didn't know how to be homeless, how to survive on the streets, how to take care of myself and my unborn baby. But you didn't turn away from me because I was a burden. You helped me because it was the right thing to do." She took his hand gently. "Now it's my turn. You're not a burden. You're family. You've been family since the moment you chose to share your last meal with a stranger." Julio felt tears welling up in his eyes. The concept of family was foreign to him, something he had observed from the outside, but never experienced himself. "I don't know how to be family," he admitted. "Neither did I," Natasha said with a smile. "But we'll figure it out together." That afternoon, Natasha brought someone special to meet Julio. She had spent the morning preparing Zuri for this encounter. reminding her of all the stories about the kind young man who had helped her mama before she was born. "Zuri," Natasha said as they entered the ICU, "I want you to meet someone very important. This is Uncle Julio." The little girl who walked into Julio's room was like a ray of sunshine. She had her mother's beautiful eyes and an infectious smile that seemed to light up the entire space. She was shy at first, hiding behind Natasha's legs, but her curiosity quickly overcame her timidity. "Are you the one who gave Mama food when she was hungry?" Zuri asked, her 3-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Yes," Julio said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am." Zuri studied his face seriously, then broke into a wide grin. "Mama says you're a hero." "I don't know about that," Julio replied, "but I'm very happy to meet you, Zuri. You're even more beautiful than your mama told me you were." The little girl giggled and moved closer to his bed. "Why do you have bandages?" "I got hurt in an accident, but your mama is taking very good care of me. She's helping me get better." "Mama is the best nurse in the whole world," Zuri declared with absolute certainty. Over the next hour, Julio found himself enchanted by this remarkable child. Zuri was bright and articulate beyond her years, full of questions and observations that made him laugh despite his injuries. She told him about her favorite toys, her best friends at daycare, and the stories her mama told her at bedtime. "Do you like stories?" she asked him. "I love stories," Julio replied. "I'll tell you one," Zuri announced, climbing carefully onto the chair beside his bed. And so she did, a rambling, imaginative tale about a princess who rescued dragons and a magical tree that grew cookies instead of fruit. It was the most wonderful story Julio had ever heard, not because of its plot, but because of the pure joy and innocence with which it was told. When visiting hours ended and it was time for Zuri to go home, she gave Julio a gentle hug, careful not to hurt his injuries. "Will you come live with us when you're better?" she asked. Julio looked at Natasha, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes," he said. "If your mama says it's okay, I'd like that very much." "Yay!" Zuri clapped her hands. "We're going to be a real family." After they left, Julio lay in his hospital bed thinking about what Zuri had said. A real family. The words carried a weight and meaning that he was only beginning to understand. Over the next few days, as his physical recovery continued, Julio began to experience something he had never felt before. The anticipation of going home. Not to a cardboard shelter under a bridge. Not to an uncertain night on dangerous streets. But to a real home where people cared about him and wanted him there. Natasha visited every day, sometimes with Zuri and sometimes alone. She told him about the small apartment where they lived, about the couch that would be his bed until they could arrange something better, about the plans she was making for his future. "I've been thinking," she said one afternoon. "You're intelligent and hard-working, and you have skills that many people don't appreciate. But you never had the chance to get an education." "I can read a little," Julio said, "and I'm good with numbers. I had to be, to survive on the streets. I know you are. But I think you could do so much more if you had the opportunity. There are programs for young adults who want to complete their education. And I have some connections at the hospital who might be able to help you find work." The idea of having a future beyond day-to-day survival was almost too much for Julio to process. For his entire life, he had never been able to plan more than a few hours ahead. The concept of education, of career prospects, of building a life rather than simply surviving one, was revolutionary. "Why would you do all this for me?" he asked. "Because you did it for me first," Natasha replied, "and because I can, and because everyone deserves a chance to build a life they can be proud of." On his 8th day in the hospital, Dr. Ogbonna declared Julio ready for discharge. His head injury had healed remarkably well. His ribs were mending properly, and while he would need crutches for his leg for several more weeks, he was stable enough to continue his recovery at home. "You have excellent caregivers," Dr. Ogbonna told him during his final examination. "Follow their instructions, take your medications, and come back for your follow-up appointments. You should make a full recovery." As Natasha helped him gather his few belongings, the clothes he'd been wearing during the accident, now cleaned and mended, and the precious business card, Julio felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Are you sure about this?" he asked her. "Are you really sure you want me in your home?" Natasha smiled and handed him his crutches. "Julio, you've been part of our family since before Zuri was born. We're just making it official now." As they left the hospital together, Julio paused at the entrance and looked back at the building that had been his home for over a week. Then he looked at Natasha and Zuri, who were waiting for him with patient smiles. For the first time in his 17 years of life, Julio was going home. The taxi ride to Natasha's apartment took 20 minutes through Abuja's bustling streets. But for Julio, it felt like a journey to another world. He sat in the back seat, his crutches propped beside him, watching the city pass by through new eyes. These weren't streets to be navigated for survival. They were simply roads leading to a place where he belonged. Zuri chattered excitedly throughout the journey, pointing out landmarks and telling Julio about the neighborhood where they lived. "That's where I go to school," she said, indicating a small daycare center. "And that's the market where Mama buys our food. And that man selling newspapers is Mr. Tunde. He's very nice and always says hello to me." Natasha watched Julio's face as he took in this ordinary world that was so extraordinary to him. She could see the wonder in his eyes, the careful way he was trying to process this new reality. Their apartment building was modest but well-maintained, in a neighborhood that catered to working-class families and young professionals. It had a small courtyard where children played and neighbors gathered in the evenings, and the sound of multiple families living their lives created a symphony of human activity that felt warm and welcoming. "We're on the 2nd floor," Natasha explained as she helped Julio out of the taxi. "There's no elevator, but we can take our time with the stairs." Climbing the stairs with crutches was challenging, but Julio managed with Natasha's support. When they reached the landing, she pulled out her keys and paused at the door. "Welcome home," she said simply, and opened the door. The apartment was small but comfortable, with a living room that doubled as a dining area, a tiny kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything was clean and carefully arranged, with touches that spoke of a home where people cared about their surroundings. There were pictures on the walls, mostly of Zuri at various ages, but also some family photos that Natasha had salvaged from her previous life. Bright curtains filtered the afternoon sunlight, and the furniture, while clearly second-hand, was well cared for and inviting. "This is beautiful," Julio said, meaning every word, to someone who had spent his entire life sleeping on concrete and cardboard. This modest apartment felt like a palace. "It is not much," Natasha said, suddenly seeing her home through his eyes and feeling self-conscious about its simplicity. "It's perfect," Julio replied firmly. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen." Zuri immediately took on the role of tour guide, showing Julio every corner of their small home. "This is my room," she announced, opening the door to reveal a space that was clearly a child's domain. Toys neatly arranged, books stacked on shelves, and drawings taped to the walls. "And this is Mama's room. And this is the kitchen where Mama makes the best rice and stew in the whole world. And this," she said, leading him back to the living room, "is where you're going to sleep." Natasha had already prepared the couch with sheets, pillows, and a warm blanket. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and comfortable, more comfortable than anywhere Julio had ever slept. "I know it's not ideal," Natasha said apologetically, "but once your leg heals and you're more mobile, we can look for a bigger place." Julio sat down carefully on the couch, testing its softness. "This is perfect," he said, running his hand over the clean sheets. "I've never had a real bed before." The simple honesty of his statement hit Natasha like a physical blow. She'd been worried about the adequacy of their accommodations, forgetting that Julio's standards of comfort were very different from her own. That first afternoon was filled with small discoveries and adjustments. Natasha showed Julio where everything was: the bathroom, the kitchen, the first aid supplies for his ongoing recovery. She explained the household routine, the building's rules, and the basic rhythms of their daily life. "We eat breakfast together before I take Zuri to daycare and go to work," she explained. "I usually get home around 6 in the evening, and we have dinner together. Zuri goes to bed at 8, and then the evening is for talking, reading, or just relaxing." The concept of routine, not the survival routines of street life, but the comfortable predictability of family life, was foreign to Julio, but appealing. He found himself looking forward to these simple pleasures: shared meals, conversations in the evening, the security of knowing where he would sleep each night. That evening, they had their first family dinner together. Natasha had cooked rice and stew, with fried plantains on the side. Simple food, but prepared with care and love. As they sat around the small table, Julio felt overwhelmed by the normalcy and beauty of the moment. "Tell me about your day, Zuri," Natasha said. And the little girl launched into a detailed account of her adventures at daycare. "And Miss Aduni read us a story about a lion who was friends with a mouse," Zuri reported. "The mouse helped the lion when he was caught in a net, even though the mouse was tiny and the lion was big." "That's a good story," Julio said. "It shows that size doesn't matter when it comes to helping people. Like how you helped Mama even though you were young?" Zuri asked, with the piercing insight that children sometimes display. "Exactly like that," Julio replied, smiling at her understanding. After dinner, they settled in the living room for what Natasha called family time. Zuri played with her toys while the adults talked, occasionally joining their conversation with observations or questions that reminded them why children see the world so clearly. "Tomorrow," Natasha said, "I need to go back to work. I've used up most of my vacation days staying with you at the hospital. Will you be okay here with Zuri while I'm gone?" The idea of being responsible for a 3-year-old was both terrifying and wonderful to Julio. Are you sure you trust me with her? Of course I do, Natasha replied without hesitation. She already loves you, and I can see how much you care about her. Besides, Mrs. Adebayo downstairs knows you're here, and she's offered to help if you need anything. That night, as Julio lay on his new bed in the quiet living room, he found himself unable to sleep, despite his exhaustion. Not because he was uncomfortable. Quite the opposite. The couch was so soft, the sheets so clean, the apartment so peaceful that it felt like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. He could hear the gentle sounds of a family at rest. Natasha moving quietly around her bedroom as she prepared for the next day. Zuri's soft breathing from her room, the distant hum of traffic that spoke of a city settling into evening rather than the harsh sounds of street life he was accustomed to. For the first time in his life, Julio felt truly safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally secure in the knowledge that he was wanted, that he belonged somewhere, that there were people who cared whether he was warm and fed and healthy. He thought about the business card that had traveled with him from that day in the alley to this moment of transformation. Such a small thing, a piece of paper that most people would have thrown away. But it had become a bridge between two lives, a symbol of connection that had endured across years and circumstances. As sleep finally began to claim him, Julio whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force in the universe had brought him to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to live as part of a family, figuring out his role in this small household, beginning to plan for a future he had never dared to imagine. But tonight he was simply grateful to be home. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and miraculous to Julio. Each morning, he would wake to the sounds of Natasha preparing breakfast and getting Zuri ready for daycare. He would join them at the small table, marveling at the simple pleasure of starting each day with people who were genuinely happy to see him. "Good morning, Uncle Julio," Zuri would chirp, her enthusiasm infectious even at early hours. "Good morning, Princess," he would reply, a routine that never failed to make her giggle. After Natasha left for work, Julio would spend his days resting and recovering, but also learning the rhythms of domestic life. He taught himself to use the washing machine, to prepare simple meals, to maintain the cleanliness and order that made their small apartment feel like a sanctuary. When Zuri came home from daycare in the afternoons, she would regale him with stories of her day while he helped her with simple activities, coloring, building blocks, or the elaborate imaginative games that 3-year-olds excel at creating. "Uncle Julio," she said one afternoon as they sat together on the living room floor, "will you tell me a story?" Julio had become Zuri's favorite storyteller, spinning tales of brave heroes and magical adventures that captivated her young imagination. But today, she had a different request. "Tell me the story about how you met Mama," she said. It was a story Julio had avoided telling in detail, unsure how to explain the harsh realities of homelessness and desperation to a child who had only known love and security. But Zuri's earnest face convinced him to try. "Once upon a time," he began, "there was a young man who didn't have very much. He lived outside, and sometimes he was very hungry, but he had a good heart, and he always tried to help others when he could." "Like a superhero?" Zuri asked. "Like a superhero who didn't have a cape," Julio agreed. One day this young man found someone who needed help more than he did. a beautiful lady who was going to have a baby. But she was sick and hungry and scared. "That was Mama," Zuri exclaimed. "That was your Mama." And even though the young man was hungry too, he shared his food with her. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't having everything you need. It's making sure other people are okay. Zuri listened with rapt attention as Julio told a carefully edited version of their story, focusing on the themes of kindness and helping others, rather than the harsh details of their circumstances. "And then what happened?" she asked when he finished. "Then your mama got better, and you were born, and you both lived happily. And years later, when the young man needed help, your mama was there to take care of him. Because when you're kind to people, that kindness comes back to you." "Is that why you live with us now?" Zuri asked with a directness that only children possess. "That's exactly why," Julio replied. "Because your mama and I are family, and families take care of each other." As the weeks passed, Julio's physical recovery progressed steadily. His ribs healed, his concussion symptoms disappeared, and his leg grew stronger. More importantly, he was experiencing an emotional healing he hadn't even known he needed. Natasha watched this transformation with wonder and joy. The wary, hypervigilant young man who'd been discharged from the hospital was gradually replaced by someone more relaxed, more open, more willing to believe in the possibility of happiness. "You're different," she told him one evening, as they sat together after Zuri had gone to bed. "How so?" Julio asked. "You smile more, you laugh, you seem lighter somehow." Julio considered this. "I think it's because I'm not afraid anymore." "Afraid of what?" "Of everything," he replied honestly. "When you live on the streets, you're always afraid. Afraid of being hurt, afraid of being arrested, afraid of going hungry, afraid of not waking up the next morning. Fear becomes such a constant part of your life that you don't even realize it's there until it's gone. And now I'm not afraid. I know where I'll sleep tonight. I know there will be food tomorrow. I know that if something bad happens, there are people who will help me. It's the most incredible feeling in the world." 1 month after his discharge from the hospital, Julio had an appointment with Dr. Ogbonna for his final medical checkup. The doctor was pleased with his recovery and officially cleared him for normal activities. "You've made a remarkable recovery," Dr. Ogbonna told him. "Not just physically, but in every way. You look like a completely different person from the young man who was brought to our emergency department." That evening, Natasha had a conversation with Julio that would shape the next phase of his new life. "Now that you're fully recovered," she said, "we need to talk about your future. What do you want to do with your life?" It was a question Julio had never been asked before. In his previous existence, the future extended only to the next meal, the next safe place to sleep. The concept of choosing a direction for his life was both exhilarating and overwhelming. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never thought that far ahead." "Well, let's start with what you're good at," Natasha suggested. "You're intelligent, you're hard-working, you're good with people. You have strong problem-solving skills, and you're incredibly resourceful. Those aren't exactly qualifications for most jobs," Julio said. "You'd be surprised. But first, I think you should get your education. There's an adult education center not far from here that offers accelerated programs for people who want to complete their secondary schooling. I've already made some inquiries. The idea of going to school at 17, sitting in classrooms with teachers and books and other students, seemed almost surreal to Julio. But as Natasha described the program, his excitement grew. It would take about a year to complete if you're dedicated, she explained. And there are scholarship programs for students who show promise. After that, you could go to university or pursue vocational training or any number of other options. You really think I could do it? Julio asked. I know you could do it, Natasha replied firmly. You've survived things that would have broken most people. Education will be easy compared to that. 2 weeks later, Julio found himself walking into the Abuja Adult Education Center for his enrollment interview. He was nervous but determined, wearing clothes that Natasha had helped him select and carrying documents that officially established his identity, something he had never possessed before. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Obioma, a kind woman in her 50s, who had dedicated her career to helping adults complete their education. Tell me about yourself, Julio, she said after reviewing his application. Julio took a deep breath and began to tell his story. Not all of it, but enough to explain his circumstances and his determination to build a better life. Mrs. Obioma listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood the challenges he had faced. We see many students who have overcome difficult circumstances, she said when he finished. What makes you think you'll be successful in our program? Because I've spent my whole life learning how to solve problems and adapt to new situations, Julio replied. I've never had the luxury of giving up when things got difficult. And because I have people who believe in me now, people who are counting on me to succeed. Mrs. Obioma smiled. Those are excellent reasons. Welcome to the program, Julio. Classes start next Monday. That evening, Julio shared the good news with his new family. Zuri was particularly excited, even though she didn't fully understand what school meant for adults. Does this mean you'll be smart like Mama? She asked. I hope so, Julio replied. But Mama was already smart. School will just help me learn new things. Can you teach me what you learn? Zuri asked. I'd love to, Julio said. And he meant it. The idea of being able to pass on knowledge to help someone else learn and grow, filled him with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. As he prepared for this new chapter of his life, Julio reflected on how completely his world had changed. 6 months ago, he had been a homeless teenager with no future beyond daily survival. Now he was a member of a loving family, preparing to begin his formal education, with dreams and goals that extended far beyond just making it through another day. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe, except for one thing. It was built on a foundation of kindness that had been laid years before, when a hungry boy chose to share his last meal with a desperate stranger. Every good thing that had happened since then could be traced back to that single moment of compassion. But Julio's story was far from over. The best chapters were still being written. Julio's first day at the Adult Education Center was both terrifying and exhilarating. He arrived early, wearing the backpack that Natasha had bought him, and carrying notebooks and pens. Simple supplies that represented a future he was still learning to imagine. The classroom was filled with people from all walks of life. A young mother who had dropped out of school when she became pregnant. a middle-aged man who had been forced to work instead of studying as a child, an elderly woman who had never had the opportunity for formal education. Each person had their own story, their own reasons for being there, but they all shared the determination to improve their lives through learning. Mrs. Aduni, their primary instructor, was a patient woman who understood that adult learners brought both challenges and advantages to the classroom. They were more motivated than typical teenagers, but they also carried the weight of other responsibilities and sometimes years of believing they weren't smart enough for formal education. Education, she told the class on that first day, is not about how quickly you learn or how much you already know. It's about your willingness to grow, to ask questions, and to persist when things become difficult. Julio threw himself into his studies with the same determination that had kept him alive on the streets. Mathematics, which he had learned informally through years of calculating prices and making change, became more structured and sophisticated. English, which he had picked up haphazardly, became a tool for precise communication and expression. History and science opened up worlds he had never known existed. But it was in the evenings, when he returned home to Natasha and Zuri, that his education truly came alive. He would sit at their small dining table, working on assignments while Zuri played nearby, and Natasha prepared dinner or relaxed after her own long day. "What are you learning today, Uncle Julio?" became Zuri's daily question. And Julio would explain in simple terms, finding that teaching a curious 3-year-old helped solidify his own understanding. When he studied biology, he would tell Zuri about how plants grew. When he learned about geography, he would show her pictures of different countries and cultures. When he practiced mathematics, he would turn it into games that made her laugh. "You're a natural teacher," Natasha observed one evening as she watched him help Zuri count her toys. "It helps me learn, too," Julio replied. "When I have to explain something to Zuri, I understand it better myself." As the months passed, Julio's confidence grew along with his knowledge. His teachers recognized his potential and began encouraging him to think about his future beyond completing his secondary education. "Have you considered university?" Mrs. Aduni asked him after he received perfect marks on a particularly challenging literature assignment. "I don't know if that's realistic," Julio replied. "University is expensive, and I don't want to be a burden on Natasha and Zuri any longer than necessary." "There are scholarship programs," Mrs. Aduni said. "And besides, completing your education isn't being a burden. It's making an investment in your future that will benefit everyone who cares about you." That evening, Julio raised the topic with Natasha. They were sitting together on the couch after Zuri had gone to bed, sharing the comfortable quiet that had become their routine. "Mrs. Aduni thinks I should apply to university," he said. "Of course you should," Natasha replied immediately. "You're one of the smartest people I've ever met, Julio. You just never had the chance to prove it before." "But the cost will work itself out," Natasha interrupted. "There are scholarships, student loans, work-study programs. And I've been thinking, I'm eligible for a promotion at the hospital that would come with a significant pay increase. We can make it work." Julio shook his head in amazement. "Why do you have so much faith in me?" "Because you've already proven that you can overcome anything," Natasha replied. Look at everything you've accomplished in just 8 months. You've gone from living on the streets to being an honor student. You've learned to be part of a family, to take care of others, to plan for the future. University will be challenging, but not nearly as challenging as surviving homelessness for 17 years. As Julio's first year of education drew to a close, he faced his final examinations with confidence. The subjects that had once seemed impossibly difficult now felt manageable, even enjoyable. He had discovered a love of learning that went beyond mere survival. He genuinely enjoyed understanding how things worked, exploring ideas, and expanding his knowledge of the world. On the day of his graduation ceremony, Natasha and Zuri sat in the front row, beaming with pride as Julio walked across the stage to receive his certificate. Mrs. Obioma announced that he had finished the program with the highest marks in his class, and the audience applauded as if he were their own family member. But for Julio, the most meaningful moment came afterward, when Zuri ran up to him with a drawing she had made especially for the occasion. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, Mama, Uncle Julio, and herself, standing in front of a house with hearts floating above their heads. "This is our family," she announced proudly, "and you're the smartest person in the whole world." That evening they celebrated with a special dinner at a restaurant, the first time Julio had ever eaten in a proper restaurant as a paying customer rather than someone looking for scraps. As they sat together, enjoying good food and each other's company, Julio reflected on how far he had come. "What's next?" Natasha asked as they prepared to leave. "University applications," Julio replied with a smile. "And whatever comes after that." "And after that?" Julio looked at Zuri, who was holding both his hand and her mother's as they walked through the parking lot, chattering about her favorite parts of the dinner. "Making sure that other kids like me get the same chances I've had," he said. "Making sure that families like ours can exist for people who need them." 3 weeks later, Julio received news that would open the next chapter of his remarkable journey. He had been accepted to the University of Abuja with a full academic scholarship. His transformation from street child to university student was complete, but his story of giving back to the world that had finally embraced him was just beginning. 5 years later, the graduation ceremony at the University of Abuja was held on a beautiful Saturday morning in June. The auditorium was packed with families celebrating their children's achievements, but in the third row, there was a small group that drew particular attention from those who knew their story. Natasha sat with tears of pride streaming down her face, watching as 23-year-old Julio walked across the stage to receive his bachelor's degree in social work. Beside her, 8-year-old Zuri bounced in her seat with excitement, holding a sign that read, "My Uncle Julio is graduating," in colorful markers. Next to them sat Mrs. Aduni from the Adult Education Center, Mrs. Obioma, who had first believed in Julio's potential, and Dr. Ogbonna from St. Grace Hospital, who had watched Julio's recovery from street child to university graduate with amazement. But perhaps the most meaningful presence in that audience was Malam Garba, the old man who had fairly purchased Julio's recyclables for so many years. Julio had found him still operating his small business and had personally invited him to the graduation. "That boy," Malam Garba had told anyone who would listen, "I always knew he was special. He worked harder than the others, never stole, never complained. But I never imagined this. As Julio's name was called and he walked across the stage, the applause from his section of the audience was thunderous. These weren't just people celebrating an academic achievement. They were witnesses to a transformation that challenged everything society believed about possibility and potential. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photographs and celebrations, Julio found himself surrounded by the people who had made his journey possible. But it was his conversation with Zuri that meant the most to him. "Uncle Julio," she said, tugging on his graduation gown, "are you done with school now?" "This kind of school, yes," Julio replied, kneeling down to her level. "But I'm going to start a different kind of school soon." "What kind?" "Graduate school. I'm going to learn how to help other children who are living on the streets, like I used to." Zuri nodded seriously. "So you can save them like Mama saved you. And like you both saved me," Julio corrected gently. That evening they held a celebration dinner at their new home, a modest 2-bedroom apartment that they had moved to when Julio's scholarship stipend allowed them to afford a larger place. The living room was decorated with balloons and a banner that Zuri had insisted on making herself. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, the three of them sat together in their living room, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you remember," Natasha said, "that first night when you came home from the hospital? You were so worried about being a burden." Julio laughed. "I was terrified. I didn't know how to live in a house, how to be part of a family. And now look at you," Natasha continued. "University graduate, about to start a master's program, already working part-time with the city's homeless outreach program. I think it's safe to say you figured it out." "We figured it out," Julio corrected. "All three of us, together." Zuri, who had been listening to their conversation while coloring in a book, looked up with the kind of profound observation that children sometimes make. "Uncle Julio," she said, "I think you were never really lost. You were just looking for us, and we were looking for you. And it just took a while for everyone to be in the right place at the right time." The adults stared at her, amazed by the wisdom in her simple statement. "You know what, Princess?" Julio said. "I think you're absolutely right." 2 months later, Julio began his master's program in social work with a specialization in youth services. His thesis topic was already chosen: "Breaking the Cycle: Innovative Approaches to Homeless Youth Intervention." His advisor, Dr. Folek Adebayo, was impressed by his combination of academic ability and real-world experience. "You bring a perspective to this field that is invaluable," she told him during their first meeting. "Most of us study homelessness from the outside. You understand it from the inside." But Julio's real education was happening in the field, where he worked 3 days a week with the Abuja Homeless Youth Initiative. His job was to build relationships with street children, to earn their trust, and to help them access services that could change their lives. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking. Many of the children he worked with were suspicious of adults, having been betrayed or exploited too many times before. Some were involved in petty crime or substance abuse as survival mechanisms. Others were simply lost, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. But Julio had advantages that his colleagues didn't. He spoke the language of the streets, he understood the unspoken rules of survival, and most importantly, He represented living proof that escape was possible. "I used to sleep under that bridge," he would tell skeptical teenagers, pointing to the overpass where he had spent countless nights. "I know what it's like to go 3 days without food. I know what it's like to be invisible to everyone around you." "So what happened?" they would ask, their guard lowering slightly. "Someone helped me," Julio would reply. "And then I learned that being helped and helping others aren't two different things. They're the same thing, just happening at different times." One of his first major successes was with a 14-year-old girl named Grace, who reminded him painfully of himself at that age. She'd been living on the streets for 2 years after running away from an abusive home situation. She was smart, resourceful, and deeply distrustful of any adult who claimed to want to help her. "Why should I believe you?" she asked Julio during their first conversation. "Every adult who's ever told me they wanted to help ended up wanting something from me." "Because I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Julio replied. "I'm asking you to let me prove that I'm different, and if I turn out to be just like the others, you can walk away any time." It took 3 months of patient relationship building before Grace agreed to enter the transitional housing program that Julio's organization operated. It took another 6 months before she was ready to consider returning to school. But when she finally walked into her first day of classes, clean, healthy, and hopeful, Julio felt the same sense of purpose that he had experienced years earlier when he shared his last meal with a pregnant stranger. "This is what I was meant to do," he told Natasha that evening. "This is why everything happened the way it did. To help other children, to prove that everyone deserves a second chance, that circumstances don't define potential, that kindness is the most powerful force for change in the world." As Julio's reputation in the field grew, he began speaking at conferences and training sessions, sharing his insights about effective approaches to homeless youth intervention. But he always made sure to credit the people who had made his journey possible. "None of us succeeds alone," he would tell audiences. "My story isn't just about personal transformation. It's about what happens when people choose to see potential where others see problems, when they choose compassion over indifference, when they choose to believe that everyone has value." And always at the end of his presentations, he would pull out a worn business card, the same one Natasha had given him years earlier, now laminated and carried in his wallet like a talisman. "This," he would say, holding it up for everyone to see, "is proof that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything." A woman I helped gave this to me when I was 14 years old. She promised that if I ever needed help, I should find her. 8 years later, when I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, she was the nurse taking care of me. She kept her promise, and in doing so, she gave me a life I never could have imagined. "The point isn't that good deeds are always rewarded," he would continue. "The point is that when we choose kindness, we create the possibility for miracles. We plant seeds that might not grow for years. But when they do, they can change the world." By the time Julio completed his master's degree, he had helped dozens of street children transition to stable housing, education, and employment. He had become a recognized expert in his field, sought after by government agencies and non-profit organizations throughout Nigeria. But perhaps his greatest achievement was much simpler. He had created a family with Natasha and Zuri that proved love was stronger than blood, that chosen connections could be deeper than biological ones, and that sometimes the most important relationships in our lives begin with a stranger choosing to be kind. 10 years after the accident, the Julio Okafor Center for Youth Development was nothing fancy. A modest building in downtown Abuja that had been renovated to provide comprehensive services for homeless and at-risk youth. But to the hundreds of young people who had found help, hope, and new beginnings within its walls, it might as well have been a palace. Julio, now 33 and bearing the title of Executive Director, stood in the center's main conference room, addressing a group of donors, government officials, and community leaders who had gathered for the center's 10th anniversary celebration. 10 years ago, he began, I was lying in a hospital bed, broken and homeless, with no future beyond day-to-day survival. Today I stand before you not as an exception to the rule, but as proof that every young person, no matter their circumstances, has the potential to transform their life and contribute to their community. In the audience, Natasha beamed with pride. Now 38 and the head nurse of St. Grace Hospital's emergency department, she had watched Julio evolve from the broken boy she had rescued to a man whose influence extended far beyond their small family. Beside her sat Zuri, now 18, and preparing to start her own university studies in education. She'd grown up understanding that families weren't just created by blood, but by choice, commitment, and love. Her childhood had been shaped by the story of how kindness could transform lives, and she had decided to dedicate her own life to teaching children who, like her uncle Julio, had been overlooked by society. The work we do here, Julio continued, is based on a simple principle. Everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, and to be given the chance to succeed. We don't just provide shelter and food. Though we do that, we don't just offer job training and education. Though we do that too. Most importantly, we provide something that many of our young people have never had, the belief that their lives matter, that their dreams are valid, and that their past doesn't have to determine their future. As applause filled the room, Julio's mind drifted to all the young people who had passed through the center's doors. Grace, who was now a social worker herself, helping other girls escape the streets. Michael, who had become a successful entrepreneur after learning computer skills at the center. Amina, who had reunited with her family and was now studying medicine. Each success story was a small miracle, but taken together, they represented something larger, a fundamental challenge to society's assumptions about worth, potential, and possibility. After the formal presentations ended, the celebration moved to the center's courtyard, where former clients, staff members, and supporters mingled in the warm evening air. But the moment that meant the most to Julio came when a young boy, perhaps 13 years old, approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said. "Are you really the director here?" "I am," Julio replied, kneeling down to the boy's eye level. "What's your name?" "Samuel," the boy replied. "I live on the streets near the market. Some of the older kids told me about this place, but I wasn't sure if it was real." Julio smiled, seeing so much of his younger self in this child's cautious hope. "It's real, Samuel, and you're welcome here. Are you hungry?" The boy nodded, and Julio led him toward the building where hot meals were always available for anyone who needed them. As they walked, Julio felt the same sense of purpose that had guided him for the past decade. "Samuel," he said gently, "has anyone ever told you that your life has value?" The boy shook his head. "Well, it does," Julio said firmly. "And tomorrow, if you're willing, we'll start figuring out how to prove it." That night, as the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Julio, Natasha, and Zuri stood together in the center's courtyard, looking up at the stars that shone over Abuya. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Natasha asked. "If we hadn't met that day behind the market, if you hadn't chosen to help me?" Julio considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I realized that we did meet, and I did choose to help, and you did the same for me years later. And now here we are, surrounded by all these other lives that have been touched and changed because of those choices." He paused, watching as Samuel, who had decided to stay overnight at the center, appeared at a window, looking down at them with an expression of cautious hope. "I think," Julio continued, "that kindness creates more kindness, that when we choose to see the humanity in someone else, we make it easier for them to choose humanity too. And that's how the world changes, not all at once, but one person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time." Zuri, who had listened to this philosophy her entire life, added her own observation. "And that's why our family keeps growing, isn't it? Because everyone we help becomes part of the family of people who help others." As they walked home together through the quiet streets of Abuja, Julio reflected on the promise that Natasha had made all those years ago when she gave him her business card. "If you ever need help, find me." She had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined, and in doing so, she had enabled him to make the same promise to hundreds of other young people. The business card was gone now, retired to a frame on the wall of his office, a reminder of where his journey had begun. But the promise it represented lived on in every child who found safety at the center, every family that was reunited, every young person who discovered that their circumstances were not their destiny. This was the true miracle of Julio's story. Not that he had escaped poverty and homelessness, though that was remarkable. Not that he had found love and family after growing up alone, though that was beautiful. The real miracle was that he had transformed his own rescue into a lifetime of rescuing others, proving that the most powerful response to receiving grace is to extend grace to those who need it most. And in the end, that is what makes a life truly heroic. Not the overcoming of obstacles, but the transformation of obstacles into opportunities to serve others. Not the accumulation of success, but the multiplication of hope. Not the escape from suffering, but the dedication to ensuring that others need not suffer alone. Julio's story began with a hungry boy making an impossible choice to give away his only meal to someone who needed it more. It culminated with a man who had built his entire life around that same principle, creating a legacy that would outlive him and touch generations of young people yet to be born. Sometimes the universe does reward kindness. Sometimes the smallest acts of love create the largest transformations. And sometimes a homeless boy and a desperate woman can save each other in ways that echo through time, proving that we are all connected by invisible threads of compassion that, when pulled, can change everything. This is the true story of how one act of kindness, born from an empty stomach and a full heart, created a chain reaction of love that transformed not just 2 lives, but hundreds of others. It reminds us that in a world that often feels broken, healing begins with our willingness to see the humanity in others and to act on that recognition, no matter how small our resources or how great our own needs. Sometimes the person you help today really will be the one to save your life tomorrow. But more importantly, the act of helping, regardless of any future reward, is what makes us most fully human.